In this video, I want to talk about how you can make your first online acquisition of a e-commerce store, like a Shopify store, or generally any other online business. I will focus on e-commerce since that's what I know best, and how this might actually be much easier than you think, and how you can actually leverage yourself financially to make a much bigger acquisition than you might assume at the moment. Just like with real estate, you don't need millions, although it helps to start participating in that asset class. Similarly, with e-commerce, you also don't necessarily need that much to start making your first acquisitions and start really exploring the space and learning and getting closer to actually buying a great online business that you would love to have. And that's really what I want to talk about, all the tips and tricks that I have seen in the space and also use myself to essentially make a online acquisition of a Shopify store, for example, and how you can do the same. So hopefully this will be really transferable. And I totally get that, for example, if you go to one of those exchanges like Flippa, you might see a lot of exciting businesses, but it might be extremely daunting and unimaginable how you can actually buy a online business that you would love to own for, let's say, 100K. And by the way, you can also buy smaller businesses, but let's just say you want to buy a business for 100K. How do you approach it? What's the best way to essentially go about it? And can you really buy something for 100K if you do not have 100K in cash? And the answer is yes. And that's really what I want to explore in this video. By the way, I do want to quickly mention this is very related to another video I have where I actually talked about how you can value your Shopify store and also a store that you potentially might launch in the future. I actually quantified all the different factors that go into a valuation, and I literally in that video, if you want to check it out, you actually can value your store. I guide you step by step, where at the end of the video you get a very concrete valuation. And I literally use one of my stores that I just started off this video to show you an example of how how valuations are formed for e-commerce stores. And by the way, all of this is based on real data. I have scraped some of the biggest exchanges where, for example, Shopify Exchange, which no longer exists, but we also did Flippa and other exchanges where, for example, we mapped out hundreds and thousands of stores, for example, here, monthly revenue over asking price, and looked at all kinds of factors and criteria that go into the different valuations. So anyway, that's a long-winded kind of approach to also all the other things you should consider. But in any case, let's jump into the actual video and talk about how you can make your first acquisition. Right, so how do you go about making your first online acquisition of a e-commerce store? So let's say you go to one of the exchanges like Flippa. I think they're one of the biggest ones. There's a bunch of other ones as well. Of course, you had Shopify Exchange owned by Shopify, which actually got taken down quite recently, which was quite a shock. But there's anyway a bunch of other exchanges like Empire Flippers and MicroAcquire. And if you just Google buy online e-commerce business, you'll see also smaller brokerage companies dealing with buying and selling those types of businesses. So there's a lot out there. But anyway, Flippa, let's say, just as an example, you can go here and you can see that by no means do they only buy and sell e-commerce businesses. They allow you also to buy a bunch of other types of online businesses like SaaS and marketplaces and so on and so forth. But within e-commerce, you have Shopify, Amazon FBA, digital products even, and inventory holding, which I'm actually not quite sure what that is. But let's just say you press on e-commerce, you will be able to see a very large listing of more than 2,800 listings currently of different e-commerce businesses that you can buy right now. And they've actually done, I think, a great job in actually providing a lot of additional information. Just a couple of years ago, here they immediately give you the profit and the revenue multiple, and already quite a lot of information. And if you press on the listing, there is actually quite a lot of information to work with. Anyway, again, I talk a lot about that in my previous video on how to value a store, where I also go through all those factors. But in any case, let's say you actually found a online business that you would love to own. And let's just say this is an arbitrary number that it costs you 100K to actually make that acquisition. However, you don't have 100K. And the question is, how can you essentially leverage yourself to at least come much, much closer to potentially making this acquisition? And of course, keeping in mind that this is really a investment, right? That you are buying a profitable asset that will give you a yield, it'll give you a return on investment that you can hopefully also improve and sell on later on for a much bigger amount. With that in mind, it's also not just money that you're gonna essentially spend and waste, so to speak. It really is an investment that you can also then you can always sell the asset and get that money back, right? So keeping that in mind, let's jump into a nice presentation which I have prepared, which is how to buy a small e-commerce business. So again, let's just stick with the 100K, again, arbitrary number, but just to keep things really simple. So what options do you have? Let's actually make this video smaller again. What options do you have when you're considering buying a online business? I think generally there's the equity component, which is going to be, there's always going to be some sort of component of actually your money to buy the business, right? I think there's no way of escaping that fully. There will be many different debt options that we can explore, and I'll talk about that in a second. One of them, and again here, there's also some overlap, is vendor financing, where the seller actually helps you finance the acquisition. They either give you a loan or they help you to split the payment, and you essentially pay it back in tranches. I'll talk about how that works. And then there's also inventory financing, which of course only applies to stores that have inventory. So if the store is drop shipping, this won't be applicable here, but I still wanted to put it there because there are specific inventory financing options out there that I think are also interesting to keep in mind. And I'll go into each one of those into detail. I try to keep it as simple as possible. Again, keeping in mind we're talking about the small range e-commerce businesses here, not big companies that sell for 50 or 100 million, right? Where this becomes, I mean, there's many actually similar components to it, but becomes very different. So let's actually dive into this. But before, I want to essentially already make two options very clear of how you can start to create this flexibility, this financial flexibility when thinking of how to make your first acquisition. Number one is obviously splitting your payments. So for example, the 100K store, right? You can pay 70K upfront and then 30K after 6 months or after 3 months or after 9 months. Again, this is all a matter of negotiation and how you negotiate with the seller, right? There's no rules written down that you have to do it in a certain way. You can split the payment into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 tranches. Again, doing it through escrow, you can actually define the milestones of when the tranches get paid out and when they don't, and if there's any, essentially, if there are any conditions of why those tranches should not be paid out, given if something happens that's unexpected, right? So this is all something that you can essentially negotiate with the seller, but keep it in mind, right? Because already this is, I think, pretty common, right? Where you pay, let's say, 70% upfront or 80% upfront, and then the remaining after 6 months. It's also great to incentivize the seller to stay on in those first 3 or 6 months as a transition period, because they're going to be financially incentivized to help you, because they obviously are still looking forward to that final payment. And in that meantime, you can still ask them questions. They're still going to be, again, incentivized to help you out, to have the smoothest possible transition, and maybe even help you beyond that in terms of advice and helping you operate the store. So just keep that in mind. That's option number one. Option number two is also doing a initial payment of, let's say, 90K, and then doing some sort of revenue share for the first 6 months or whatever you agree. Again, just a matter of negotiation. And all those figures are just examples, again, highlighting that it doesn't need to be 90K. It can be also, again, 70, 80K, 50K, again, depending on how you negotiate it. And the revenue share doesn't strictly need to be a revenue share. It can also be a profit share. With a profit share, however, watch out. Be sure to clearly define what the profitability is to the cent, because everyone, especially in the smaller size segment of e-commerce, has different definitions for net profit, and people include and exclude different costs all the time. So I think that's why revenue share is more common, because it's just much simpler to look at the revenue your Shopify store makes on the analytics dashboard and just take a percentage of that. I think typically 1 to 5% revenue share for the first 6 months is relatively standard from what I have seen, but this is just something that, again, depends on many other factors. But again, hopefully those two options already slowly help you understand how you can create this wiggle room to not straight up have 100K in cash that you need to pay, and that you can essentially start talking about splitting the payments depending on different tranches, on different milestones, how you can create a revenue or profit share component and also allow you to bring in some flexibility here. Okay, but now let's get into the interesting part. I'll actually skip this for a second because there are also other factors that you need to keep in mind when negotiating. And that's obviously macro environment, your negotiation skills, the acquire intent and synergies, the store intangibles, and also the timing. Those are all really important. And I mentioned this actually in my other video in quite a bit of detail, but I actually do want to get really into the meat and potatoes of now how you can leverage yourself financially to make that acquisition. So I already mentioned equity, debt, vendor financing, and inventory financing. And I'll just break it down in a bit more detail, right? Equity is, strictly speaking, your own money, but again, it doesn't need to be your own money per se. It could be also money that you have borrowed from a friend even, right? And technically that is money that you can at least present to the seller as equity. It's anyway money that essentially comes from your name, so to speak, right? Whereas debt is external financing. Debt, again, I would really split into short-term and long-term debt. Short-term debt is, for example, very classic with Shopify, and I have a separate video on that, revenue-based financing, right? If you have a Shopify store and you go and essentially go under the capital section of your settings, you will essentially see, for example, even a automated offer from Shopify Capital, which they even provide you short-term loans based on the revenue that your Shopify store makes, right? And there's many other providers like Wayflyer, Uncapped, or Clearco Bank that do such short-term loans specifically to e-commerce stores and many other online businesses that you can essentially also look into. How that works is, by the way, I'll actually go into that in the next slide, but it's something you would have to do right after you make the acquisition, and you would need to bridge that gap potentially with a bridge loan, which again is another short-term loan that you also have separate providers focusing on specifically the bridge loan type of aspect. You obviously also have long-term debt. This is much harder to get, but there are also acquisition debt providers, for example, on MicroAcquire or even on Flippa. There's a couple of them that literally on the listing, they pre-approve the store as eligible for acquisition capital. And I should actually show you some examples, which I'll do later on, that assuming you actually make the acquisition and you get far enough where you actually are close to signing, for example, the asset purchase agreement, and you already have figured out most of the terms with the seller, you can then also talk to that acquisition capital provider who will help you finance that acquisition to a certain component, right? And we'll talk percentages very soon. Finally, there's also vendor financing that can be seen as debt as well. So here there is some overlap, and those terms can also be used interchangeably. What is vendor financing? That's where the seller, for example, out of the 100K, they say, look, pay me 80K upfront, and the other 20K that you still owe me, you don't have to pay me right now. It's essentially a loan that I give you, and you pay me a 10% interest rate on that loan, and you pay it off over the first year, right? And at the end of the year, you pay me 20K plus the interest that you owe on that loan, right? That's one form of vendor financing, right? It's where the vendor essentially helps you bridge the gap of the initial payment and allows you to essentially take out a loan with them. And again, that loan might be a zero interest loan. It might have a very high interest. Again, it might be split. It might be a bullet payment. It might amortize over a given amount of time. There's, again, all those different options. What you need to know, right, is that there's many different options, and it's a matter of negotiation like everything else. Finally, why I put inventory financing here is because there's companies that specifically focus on providing inventory financing, and it's a thing where you can value inventory, and it's actually quite common. And I've ran into this issue myself, where you might want to buy a store worth 200K, but the inventory they have is worth 150K on top, right? So all of a sudden the acquisition is actually 350K, not just 200K. But there's companies that specifically allow you to value that inventory, which is much easier than valuing a business, right? Because inventory is just the cost that usually the previous owner in this case, has paid for that inventory, right? And there's a very clear dollar amount, and of course, it can be, it could depreciate over time. But anyway, that's pretty clear how you can value it, and they can give you financing on top of that valuation. So keep that in mind, because it's also something you can play around with. Of course, not applicable for dropshipping stores or many other stores that don't have inventory. But even there, you have a few other options, but I'm focusing on the main one. So what does this mean for you? Let's say, again, the 100K that you need to actually finance to make the acquisition, you could potentially actually split like this. You can split it 40% equity, 30% short-term debt, 10% long-term debt, and the vendor financing is another 20%, which actually gets you to the 100K, which means that you yourself only need 40K upfront to make the acquisition. So let's say you have 40K upfront to make the acquisition. What is short-term debt? Short-term debt, and how would that work? And it's a bit more complicated. I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible. Is if you essentially if you have a Shopify store, right? Maybe I should just show you. And let's go here. You can see that, for example, for this Shopify store, if you go under settings and under capital, I'm eligible to get a loan of 32K in pounds, which is close to 40K dollars, right? So this is something that I could essentially get very, very quickly. And there's other providers that would also be able to give me competitive quotes, where, let's say, just for this store straight away, I could get 40K. That's a short-term loan. That's something you would need to pay back in something like 2 or 3 months. But again, you can repeat that cycle, and it is expensive. I have a separate video on revenue-based financing. Check it out, where I break down exactly what those fees mean, what the annual percentage rate actually is, because that's not what they quote you here. That's a little bit of a not a trick, but the pricing model is a little bit confusing, perhaps, if that's the first time you're seeing it. So I go through that, but this is a short-term loan that you can essentially get straight away. It is, however, the caveat, right, is that this is not something you can get before you make the acquisition for the most part, unless you've already built a relationship with one of those providers. This is something that you would have to do right after you make the acquisition. And even there are some challenges, because they actually want to see 3 months of bank statements for you to get a loan like that. Not on, actually, Shopify Capital doesn't require that necessarily, but many other providers do, like Wayflyer, Uncapped, or Clearco. They want specifically bank statements. Now, you could technically get the bank statements from the previous owner. This might be enough, right? But that's just something to keep in mind. Again, not to go on too many adjacents, but do keep in mind that this is a possibility. You've already seen a little bit more than I was supposed to show you, but that's a short-term debt component, and I think it is realistic if the store is doing well, right? And you essentially find the right opportunity that you can cover actually 30% of that 100K through short-term financing, right? Now, and I'll show you how that breaks really how you can break it down into a timeline that's actually somewhat realistic. Then you have long-term debt. Again, long-term debt might be one of those acquisition providers on MicroAcquire or Flippa that have pre-vetted that listing and help you get longer-term financing of actually 10% being pretty conservative here. I think you can definitely get 10, 20, 30, 40% in terms of long-term debt. It might also just be, long-term debt could also be like you have a friend or someone you know in your network who borrows you, in this case, 10K for a year, right? And you promise them a 20% IRR on that, whatever that interest rate will be. And you obviously sell them the story of how you're buying a profitable asset that will pay back this loan in a year, and et cetera, right? And that might also be a long-term debt, and that obviously depends on your personal situation. And finally, the vendor financing, which I already explained, right? That's something you can negotiate with the seller, where they're also able to essentially finance 20% of that acquisition for you, and you pay it back over a given amount of time. So how does this look like in terms of timeline? So again, here, combining with the first slide that I showed you initially, you can essentially split this into now and 6 months after, right? Now you would need the equity component, the long-term debt component, for example, the acquisition capital and the vendor financing. And again, the short-term debt, which I just showed you with the revenue-based financing, this will take you, you will have to do that after you make the acquisition, right? But 6 months is definitely plenty of time to do that, where you could essentially make the acquisition today with the 70K, right? Where for only 40K of that is your own money. You then have long-term debt with the acquisition capital provider. You then have the vendor essentially give you 20K as a loan that you also pay off over, let's say, a year or more, whatever you negotiate, right? And then you have 6 months to essentially apply to those revenue-based financing providers to get a short-term loan of 30K, which might even be much, much more if you manage to grow the store in the meantime, right? Because it's obviously correlated to the revenue that your store makes, right? So if your store revenues grow, right, you might actually get way more than 30K, right? So that's one way of actually being able to make your first acquisition with much less than what hopefully you came into this video thinking that you might need. And plus inventory financing. Again, I just added that there, not to forget, right? If the store has inventory, then this is something that you can also finance. I also would split this into the kind of working capital bucket. To be clear, once you buy the store, you should set aside additional financing for the working capital needs, which you will have, especially if you're looking to scale. And inventory financing, I would say, is a part of that as well. But that's a bit of a separate story, and I don't want to go into too many different adjacents here. Another option is, again, getting all the different tools involved, also the revenue share and the profit share that I mentioned initially. What you could do is, for example, now you pay 80K up front, then 10K, and that together notably is not the 100K, it's 90K. And again, leave a component that essentially is a revenue share or a profit share with the seller, right? So you can negotiate those things, and I think it's just also reasonable to tell the seller, look, instead of 100, like if we both agree 100K is the reasonable valuation of this asset, of this store, we can say, look, 90K, what might also be reasonable is that instead of 100K, we pay you 90K, but then there's a revenue share for the first 3 months, which if we just continue base rate on the historical trajectory of the store, you will actually make more than 100K, right? However, it makes sense for you as the buyer because you only pay 90K up front and you hedge yourself that if the store doesn't do well or as well as it has done historically, you actually pay less than 100K because obviously the revenue share component will be smaller than the difference, right? And again, I think here you can actually be more aggressive, again, just depending on a lot of the other factors that go into a negotiation like this, but it might be that you actually only need, again, let's say 60 or 70K up front, then short-term debt only 5 or 10K, and then actually leave a 20% component that you kind of pay off on the revenue share, right? And if the store does really well, then the seller also gets compensated additionally as a bonus. And if the store doesn't do well, you hedge yourself and you essentially limit your downside by having not paid that much revenue share. And again, this revenue share can also be a profit share. I'll go into a few kind of just tips that I would recommend for you in terms of revenue share and profit share in the next slide, which we're already at. So a few tips and tricks, action and revenue and profit share will be one of them. But let's start again with using escrow for all your transactions. I would really recommend that it's anyway standard practice. But escrow, in case you don't know, is a service where essentially if you buy a store for 100K and you need to transfer in 100K, you would transfer to this third-party account. They would hold that money in a separate third-party bank account and only release it once you actually confirm as the buyer that all the assets have been truly received in the way that has been initially promised to you by the seller in the asset purchase agreement, for example, if that's how you do it, which I'm also going to touch on in a second. And this service you should always use, right? That's just it's just a clean, more professional way to do those transactions. It protects you. It protects both the buyer and seller. It protects you against disputes. It's also just not that expensive for the service that it provides, right? You obviously pay a fee of a couple of percentage points, or actually even less. I mean, again, it depends on a few different things and how big your transaction is. It's not that expensive and it's always worth it. So definitely always use a escrow service. Asset purchase agreements are typically easier than share purchase agreements. Why? And what does that mean? Typically, when you see online store being listed in Flippa or some of the other exchanges, right? Essentially, what they're saying is you can buy up all the assets of that store, right? But you're not buying the legal entity behind that store, right? Which might actually be a company, it might be an LLC in the US, or it might be a LTD in the UK, or it might be a GmbH in Germany, right? Whatever it might be, it's not that, right? That's a share purchase agreement, which you should try to avoid. And typically, the standard across those exchanges is that those are most of the assets. Most of the stores and e-commerce businesses for sale are actually intended to be sold through a asset purchase agreement. The only big exception I would mention here is that share purchase agreements have tax advantages in some jurisdictions. Don't forget all the store assets during a acquisition. That's anyway on good listings. They mention all the assets that you acquire, right? That's not just the Shopify store and their marketing channels like their Facebook Business Manager and their Pixels and their Google Ads Manager and their Pinterest account and their social media accounts. It's also things like their content, right? And all kinds of files that they might have. They might have a supplier contract, right, which should also be included. It might be some sort of copyright or trademark agreement or document. It might be some sort of other protection, right? I'm just really thinking out loud here. There's all those other kind of ancillary assets that the store might have. It might also be kind of intangible assets, so to speak. So really think about all the different things associated with that store, because when you're making that acquisition, you should really also make sure in a bullet point list you specify all the things you're actually buying to make sure that there's no dispute where the seller doesn't actually say that, oh yeah, but you didn't mention that all the content is included in the sale, so I'm actually going to keep some of those creatives, right, which obviously isn't great. So make sure to not forget any of the assets. And I actually have a very long list of all the assets that might be included in the store, which I can share also separately. Anyway, it's not that crazy, but just keep it in mind. Don't forget a non-compete clause, pretty obvious, but you don't want the seller to, after they sell the store to you, to just open up a similar store the next week and start competing with you. That's also pretty standard and will protect you, at least legally, if that does ever happen. So don't forget to include that. Typically for 3 years, it can also be longer. And yeah, if you do a profit share, going back to that, then define the profit very clearly. Everyone has a different agreement on what they mean with profit. And that is something that you have to define extremely clearly of what costs you include and exclude, so that you avoid any of the disputes later on. So I think those are the tips and tricks that, and time for working capital needs. That was the last point, where once you buy a store and you want to scale and you want to buy inventory, and you might need to bridge the gap that PayPal or Shopify payments or many other of those payment processors have in terms of the money that gets stuck in kind of temporarily between when you make the revenue and when it actually gets paid out onto your bank account. And for that, you should definitely also plan for your working capital needs. I discussed it also previously with some of the tools that you can use in terms of revenue-based financing and inventory financing and so on and so forth. Anyway, hopefully this has been helpful for you to kind of get a feel for how you can actually be more flexible when approaching a potential acquisition of a very interesting online business that you would love to own one day. And by the way, if you're looking to buy a store and you have a clear idea, or you're actually looking to sell a store, reach out to me. This might also be interesting for me to take a look at and potentially even help you finance part of that acquisition from a debt component. I actually find some of those opportunities quite interesting and something that I'll also love to underwrite under some, definitely for some stores out there, which I also find pretty exciting. Hey, before you bounce, check out some of the Shopify apps that we have built for our own stores, which might be useful for your stores. So we're very excited to hear your feedback, and check it out in the link below.